Welcome, everybody. Hi, Nancy and Art. Good to have you here. Hi, Virginia. Barbara, thanks for being here. Paul, hello, Paul, from the Twin Cities. Hi, Marie, Jocelyn. Lawrence, thanks for being here. Hi, Mike, Judy, Claire, Louise. Good to have you all here. Leela, are we mostly in? Okay, great. Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to this month's Acting for Justice event. My name is Jack Jezreel, and I serve on the staff of Just Faith Ministries. I'm joined tonight by my colleague, Leela Oakley, and we're delighted you could join us. Let's begin our program this evening with a prayer. I have selected this prayer inspired by the young climate activists of Montana who won a landmark decision this week in defense of the environment. Let us pray. As the light of the Spirit of life enters through the cracks made of sorrows in the hearts of humans, a shimmering begins to flutter throughout humanity. Cracks made of sorrow from the reports of this creature being extinguished forever, another great forest being demolished, aquifers being forever poisoned, climate refugees walking hundreds of miles searching for safety for their children. A contagious blessing, these cracks, which let the light of the Spirit of life enter billions of hearts, drawing those filled with love to gather and hone this love for all they hold dear into courage. While children who show the way forward become heroes, illuminating the path with insight and truth, while there is still time to save the world. Whether or not you believe you were born at this time for a reason, you are alive at a critical juncture in humanity's journey, with your choices determining whether or not there is a future. The facts are clear. Time is short, becoming shorter with each passing moment. Yet, there is a shimmering beginning to flutter with a butterfly's grace. From one heart to another, it whispers, rise. There is still time. This is the year to save the world. Amen. And now it's my pleasure to introduce you to tonight's presenter. Sarah Bradley is the co-founder of the Nuns and Nuns Land Justice Project, a collaboration with religious landowners and movement partners to create land transitions rooted in racial and ecological healing. She's also a founding member of the experimental community that grew out of Nuns and Nuns, an intergenerational, interspiritual community dedicated to contemplation, care, and courageous action in service of life and liberation. Sarah grew up in Ute, Goshute, and Eastern Shoshone Territory in Salt Lake City, Utah, and currently lives on Tewa land in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Sarah, we're delighted to have you. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Jack and Leela. Thank you all for being here. I'm just going to get my slides up here and we can begin. All right, is everyone seeing that all right? Okay. Well, thank you so much for that welcome. It's a real honor to be with you here today. And I want to appreciate everyone for joining, for showing up to learn about land justice and the connection between our private property system and the project of settler colonialism, as well as the incredibly creative and transformative ways that we can heal that legacy. Before we begin, I'm curious to know just a little bit more about who's in the room. So I'm wondering if we could just take a few very, very short polls, just using the chat and a scale from 1 to 5. So using the chat, how many folks here are familiar with the term land justice and what it means? So go ahead and put your answers in the chat, with 1 being not familiar at all, and 5 meaning you know a whole lot about it. And I'm just going to give a few seconds for this. So first guess, best guess. Okay. Got a spread. Thank you. You can let that keep going in. Another question, how many folks here know what the doctrine of discovery is? 1 to 5. Okay, we've got 1s, 5s, 4s. Lots of 1s and 5s, so cool. We got a spread. And how many people feel like they could pretty clearly explain the connection between the church, US property law, and our climate crisis? Again, 1 to 5. Well, so interesting. Makes me so curious about who you all are. Well, great. My hope is that by the end of this session, you will know a whole lot more about all 3 of those things, that you will come away with an understanding of how the church and its purported doctrine of discovery created the conditions for our modern extractive economy and private property system, and their outcome, our current climate crisis and endemic and systemic racism. And my hope is that you'll come away with an understanding of how land justice, including concrete examples of it, can be the medicine that moves us towards racial and ecological justice, and how you can play an active part of that movement. It's a lot to cover, but I'm going to do my best. We're combining a few sessions that we normally do over much longer periods. So if it feels juicy, it's because it is. Again, as Jack mentioned, I'm part of the Nuns and Nuns Land Justice team. And our mission is to create land transitions centered on racial and ecological healing, and doing that in partnership and collaboration with movement partners and women religious. We do this through offering our public programming and education about land justice, as well as our flagship Focus Community program, where we work closely with 7 to 10, religious communities, so that is communities of sisters or nuns, to incorporate land justice into their property planning process and upcoming land transitions. Using a cohort model for groups of communities, our work focuses on education and accompaniment, creating a community of practice, partnership building with potential stewards, and technical support from our faculty of aligned practitioners in the fields of law, real estate, and land trusts. All right, so that's us, hooray. We define land justice as the practice of centering social, racial, and ecological justice in decisions about how land is used, loved, and governed by people. And there are 3 key and very intertwined components of land justice. First, protecting land from extractive development. Second, regenerating the health of the ecosystem. And third, shifting equity and control of land to communities who have been systematically dispossessed of land, especially Black and Indigenous stewards. So that's just a little bit of a preview of where we're going, but before I dive in more, I'd like to just add a little bit of context as to how we entered into doing this work with sisters. We won't have time for the whole wild tale, but I'll start by just saying that the Land Justice Project was born out of relationships through conversations and listening to the moment with sisters and with grassroots movement leaders. Nuns and Nuns first started in 2016 as a place of encounter between older women religious and younger community-oriented activists of many spiritual backgrounds, many of whom did not claim a single religious affiliation, earning the nickname nuns, as in none of the above. I grew up Catholic. My godmother's on the call. Hi, Nancy. These encounters took the form of dialogues and meetups all over the country, centered on shared interests of justice, spiritual formation, and community. I found this movement when I was in my late 20s and exploring important questions in my own life. And I was just so deeply inspired by how communal religious life set up a very practical pathway to a radical economy and a radical way of life. So that's what drew me in. And while these encounters unfolded, two things were also happening. First, our nation began to more intensively face longstanding existential reckonings. The intertwined crises of pandemic, climate collapse, and racial injustice revealed just how deep the roots of colonization and racism run through our history and how pervasive their impacts are in our systems today. Secondly, we witnessed our friends, the sisters, move through the experience of their communities aging, growing smaller, and needing to make tough decisions. Most communities of women religious in the country are either currently facing or will soon be facing the need to make long-term decisions about what to do with land and property. This is also true of many churches, parishes, and families as the baby boomer generation ages. So we began to ask, what shall we do, given what time it is on the clock of the world, to quote the late, great Grace Lee Boggs? Given the ecological and racial healing that we so desperately need in our time, what shall we, the nuns and the nuns, do together? So we had a bunch of conversations. We talked to sisters, we talked to retreat centers, we talked to grassroots movement partners, and by that I mean climate justice groups, rematriation and reparations leaders, solidarity economy collectives, etc. And it was through asking that question and the conversations it prompted that we began to see our role. We recognize that as a society, we desperately need land to be in the hands of regenerative, just, and visionary stewards. But one of the biggest barriers to climate and racial justice initiatives today is access to land. So we realized that landowners also needed to be organized in order for land justice to happen, and that it just wasn't happening. So, with the steadfast encouragement of sisters and our movement partners, the Nuns and Nuns Land Justice Project was born in 2021 with the purpose of supporting religious communities to incorporate land justice into their property planning. This is an image from our May gathering this year, which was really incredible. And this is just some interesting tidbits. But in doing this work, I'll just name decisions about property can feel daunting, and that they are often held in this very narrow business mindset, rather than a holistic or values-rooted one. People often separate their justice work or their ministry from these kinds of decisions. So we really see the potential for property decisions to bring forth powerful transformation in our society. If people of faith were to center land justice in their property decisions, it could be one of the most significant things we do. And it could help tell a new story of what's possible and create a livable future for us all. But in order to tell a new story, we have to understand the old ones we're living inside of, the stories of how we got here and the roots of land injustice, so that we might move from a foundation of truth towards repair. In his writings about sustainable economies, E.F. Schumacher wrote, "One who uses an imaginary map, thinking that it is a true one, is likely to be worse off than someone with no map at all." For 500 years, when it comes to our dominant culture, and especially land and property, this has been our map. This is one of the three 15th century papal bulls, or legal decrees, letters by the Pope, that make up the doctrine of discovery. These decrees compelled European nations to, quote, invade, capture, vanquish, and subdue all non-Christians. Through these bulls, the church declared that any land not inhabited and ruled by Christians was available to be discovered and claimed outright. These papal bulls acted as the legal, political, moral, and spiritual justification for some of the most heinous projects over the next centuries: the genocide of indigenous peoples and the theft of indigenous land, the transatlantic slave trade, and by 1914, the colonization of 84% of the land on Earth by European nations and descendants, including the landmass now called the United States. These decrees were inherently white supremacist and Christian supremacist, and they justified grotesque violence. As many of you are aware, the Vatican recently repudiated the doctrine, stating that its ideas are antithetical to Catholic teaching. However, it's critical to clarify that this announcement did not formally repeal or rescind the doctrine. It did not take responsibility for its implementation. It did not put resources towards making amends or reparations, nor did it extricate the doctrine from our current legal system. And as I'll name next, the doctrine of discovery is an active legal doctrine in the United States. It's a linchpin in the foundation of modern property law. And this is partly why. 200 years ago this year, in a case called Johnson versus McIntosh, the Supreme Court enshrined the papal bulls into US law, citing that, quote, discovery is the foundation of title, and this overlooks all proprietary rights in the natives. This is one of the first cases that new lawyers learn in law school. It is considered one of the bedrock cases in US property law to this day and set the precedent for everything else that would follow. The papal bulls have been cited by the Supreme Court as recently as 2005 in a case that ruled against the Oneida people who were trying to recover their stolen land in what is now upstate New York, a majority opinion that was written by Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Many of you will recognize this image from school history books. It depicts manifest destiny, or the westward expansion of white settlers into what is now the US. Notice as the angel and the white farmers are moving in, the native people and the buffalo are fleeing, almost disappearing off the page. White settlers believed they had the right to kick people off of their land, to destroy their way of life, and to take whatever they found. This belief is rooted in the doctrine of discovery. This image also promotes the false idea that the US grew into as the US grew into what it has become, the peoples indigenous to this land just kind of disappeared and gave up, which is obviously not true. What's not pictured here is that settlers also believed they had the right to capture and enslave indigenous African people and bring them here to work the lands they stole, creating an economy that depended on the domination not just of native land, but also of Black bodies, knowledge, and labor. And we see how this system shapeshifts in the many ways that people of color are dispossessed of land today, how immigrants are exploited for their labor, and how the people who control land and political influence find new ways to extract profits through destructive practices. Again, this is an economy that is built upon extracting wealth from the land and labor of people of color, and it bears a direct line of connection to the papal bulls. We can see this story through another image. This is a place you'll likely recognize and know by the name of Mount Rushmore. However, this place, located in the Black Hills, has a much older name, Haisapa. It is one of the most sacred grounds for the Aceti-Shakowin, the Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota people. It is their emergence point, akin to a Christian's Garden of Eden. Led by the US Army and the greed of gold mining interests, white colonists stole these sacred hills, knowingly breaking a treaty in which the US had agreed to never touch these hills. Then, into that sacred stone, a part of which the Lakota called the Six Grandfathers, they carved the faces of 4 of their white leaders, each of whom participated in genocide against indigenous people. During President Trump's July 4th celebrations at Mount Rushmore in 2020, a group of Lakota activists exercised their right to free speech and their responsibilities as the rightful stewards of the Black Hills, demanding the return of Haisapa, which under treaty law is still their land. These activists were arrested by police dressed in riot gear and criminally charged simply for standing up for the rights guaranteed to their nation by treaty with the US government. So this picture, I think, is an apt metaphor for how we got here today, to where we are today, rather, through land theft, destruction, and cultural domination. And where we are currently is that 98% of private land in the United States is owned or controlled by white people, rather than indigenous people who, up until recently, had communally stewarded this land since time immemorial. There's an important reframe needed as we understand the story of colonization. This image here is from an archive of photos from the Carlisle Indian Boarding School. Many of us grew up with the idea that the US is a nation of immigrants. However, immigrants take on and adapt to the local customs, language, laws, and governance, and other social systems of the place they move to. That is not what happened on Turtle Island. The more accurate description for the dominant US system and culture is that it reflects a nation of settlers. Settlers destroy in order to replace. Rather than adapt to indigenous economies and ways of life, white settlers violently imposed their own. Rather than respecting the sovereignty of the nations they were moving to, white settlers attempted to eradicate them and force them into subjugation and dependency on the colonial state. So, to review, at least the land story here, it was through the doctrine of discovery that indigenous lands were stolen, allotted into parcels, and then given or sold to white people by white colonial governments. There's a lot more that we could get into here about just how this happened: US trading posts and Indian agents, patents, the Homestead Act, the Dawes Act, so much more. But for now, this simple statement will stand. So these parcels of land continue to be passed down and sold as private property, enforced and policed by the state. We see these hard boundaries in fences, barbed wire, and no trespassing signs. And most people really only have the choice to accept these lines or face state violence. And once these grids of private property were created by the US government, the state and settlers adopted the idea of fair market value of land. That is, monetary value for land that matches the price that the highest bidders are willing to pay. Fair market value of land is often thought of as natural and inevitable, but it's important to remember that it's a fairly new practice in human history, and there have been many other ways societies have made decisions about land. Fair market just means that people with the most money, not the people with the deepest relationships or the ones best positioned to steward land, get to decide what happens to land. So I'd say it's more accurate to call this unfair market value. And as will likely surprise no one in this room, in our current society, the highest bidder in the US is statistically most likely to be white. Today, the median white family in the US has a net wealth of $147,000, while the median Black family has a net wealth of $3,500. This is but one facet of the racial wealth and wellness gap. The racial wealth gap comes from an accumulation of many forms of harm to communities of color, the land theft and enslavement that we've been talking about, but also redlining, incarceration, and many, many other forms of discrimination. And on the other side of that gap, white people in our society have accumulated massive amounts of wealth because of a system that has been designed for us to acquire and then pass down property to heirs over centuries. White families have 16 times more wealth than Black families. The average Native American household has 8 cents of wealth for every dollar in the average white American household. And Native Americans have the highest national poverty rate at 25%, compared with 8% for white Americans. And this is, of course, a self-perpetuating wealth gap. We can talk about this dynamic with fancy economic terms like primitive accumulation and regulatory capture, but the result is very simple. Because white settlers and the colonial state stole Native land and Black labor, they amassed enormous wealth. And because those with wealth can leverage it to direct political agendas, they protect and increase that wealth and status through our various social systems across time. In land, we see that the result today is that 98% of private rural land is owned by white people and 95% of urban land. Meanwhile, people of color continue to be a backbone of labor in our economy, comprising 70% of the farmers in this country. So farmers of color are 70% of the agricultural workforce, but own less than 2% of the farmland. This means that we all probably ate something today grown by a farmer of color who works on white-owned land. So the doctrine of discovery set up our current paradigm and system of treating land as a commodity, but it did not just make an object of the world. It gave individuals the right to destroy the land that they own. As a landowner, you get a whole bundle of rights that convey with title, like the right to lease, to occupy, to sell, to develop, but you also get the right to destroy it. Last April, we hosted a conversation with 4 Indigenous and Afro-Indigenous leaders about the doctrine's repudiation. In that conversation, Danae Elder, Pat McCabe put it simply: the doctrine wasn't just a moral or ethical imposition, it was the beginning of the destruction of this Mother Earth in her entirety. So the church's logic of white Christian superiority over all of creation was cemented into our modern economy and land use. And with that, we need to recognize some plain facts. Since those papal bulls and the colonial contact that followed, in the US, we have lost 90 to 95% of old growth forest, 99% of prairie, and 1/3 of our topsoil. It is estimated that we have less than 60 harvest seasons of topsoil left, and we are losing topsoil faster than it can be replenished. Meanwhile, land is being developed at a rate of 1,500 acres a day, and from the Willow oil drilling project in Alaska to Enbridge oil pipelines in the Midwest, our elected officials, banks, and businesses continue to promote and profit off of this destruction. And again, all of this has happened during the centuries and decades when land has been in the overwhelming control of white settlers in the state, 98% of private land. So we have to ask the question, if settler colonialism is destroying to replace with what? What kind of society? What has the doctrine of discovery created in and through us? To turn the tide in this society, we need to recognize our need for leadership that is appropriate for the task at hand. In Laudato Si', Pope Francis writes, "When Indigenous peoples remain on their land, they themselves care for it best." He implores Catholics to build relationships with Indigenous people as the primary dialogue partners when it comes to care for the earth. And of course, science backs these assertions. While Indigenous people make up less than 5% of the world's population, they protect 80% of the world's biodiversity. And we can also see it here in this aerial image of the aftermath of the bootleg fire in Oregon, where the completely scorched area at the top was managed by the US Forest Service. The slightly damaged but still surviving area at the bottom was co-managed with the Klamath, and the area in the middle that made it out the best was under sole management of the Klamath tribe. Indigenous people, when allowed to practice their communal traditions, know how to care for and steward the land they have co-evolved with. This is one reason why the land back and climate justice movements are so intertwined. So when we make these connections, it becomes clear that racism and colonization are the root of our climate crisis. And the church bears a significant responsibility for the project of colonization that has led us here and maintains the status quo. And so even though the Vatican has publicly rejected the statements made in these bulls, the damage has been done. It is not enough to say, sorry, we were wrong. While apologies are necessary, alone they are insufficient. As Catholics, if we want to engage in the work of healing and repairing both ecological and racial relationships, we need to grapple with this history and our role in it. and we need to work to undo the damage to both land and people. Our friend Sarah Augustine, a Pueblo minister from New Mexico and leader in the Mennonite Church, says of the doctrine of discovery, "What was done in the name of Christ must be undone in the name of Christ." After hundreds of years of racial harm and ecological destruction that has been brought about by the doctrine of discovery, we are today witnessing a growing movement to address these harms, a movement to engage the world with a completely different paradigm. So the legacy of the doctrine of discovery can be undone. And by doing so, by taking responsibility for this legacy and joining the movements for mending it, we can contribute to the change of era that Francis writes about. Now, you might be saying, okay, I'm ready. I get why we need land justice. I understand its importance, but how? What does it look like? Well, okay, I'm going to show you. So I'm going to share a few examples, but I'll also say that in practicing land justice and making a new map for how we make decisions about land, the path is going to look a little bit like this. There is no one way up this mountain. If the goal is land justice and we're walking towards it, every community is going to have a different context for what that's going to look like. And if you think about it, when we're moving without a map, we suddenly have to pay really good attention. Where's the sun rising? Which way is north? Where's the water? What's the slope? All of those clues. So I'm going to invite you to practice some attentiveness, looking for clues as to how you might move forward as you receive a few stories. Okay, first one. This is a picture of the Shinnecock kelp farmers, 6 women indigenous to the area called Long Island. And their project began because they saw that all of the Hampton Bays on Long Island, including Shinnecock Bay, were being polluted by billionaire septic systems and golf courses, causing huge algae blooms and dead zones. Now, the Shinnecock carry an ancestral practice which is extremely helpful in this situation, growing kelp. For at least 10,000 years, the Shinnecock have grown kelp as a food source, a versatile fiber for traditional uses, and as an ecological management system. Kelp filters carbon dioxide at a rate 20 times that of a forest on land. And it also filters out nitrogen, which is what creates those algae blooms. So the Shinnecock wanted to reclaim their traditional practice in order to clean the waters. But because of the story we were just telling and that we're currently living in, their reservation is relegated to the marshiest part of the bay, that zone right there in the red at the bottom. So they needed better coastal access. And guess who had some? Why, the Sisters of St. Joseph in Brentwood, New York. Their 9-acre retreat center is right there on Shinnecock Bay. And I'll shout out that the CSJs in Brentwood are one of our first 7 focus communities. The Shinnecock knew the CSJs because some of those sisters had been showing up to their protests for a few years. So Becky, the elder of the Shinnecock group, she's the second from the left, went up to Sister Joan Gallagher and said, "This is what we want to do." She shared the plan. And Joan replied, "Absolutely, whatever you need will help." So together, they turned a building at the retreat center into a kelp hatchery, and the Shinnecock revived this 10,000-year-old practice. The sisters donated a car to one of the farmers who was having transportation issues so that she could keep coming and farming. And I really love what Joan says about this relationship. She says, being in relationship with the Shinnecock in solidarity must be at the heart of who we are, because a future emerges from the relationships that we cultivate in the present. So in this example, we see that making a commitment to a reparative relationship of solidarity, and for that commitment to be a core part of identity, is a step towards land justice. Even if it hasn't yet resulted in a formal transition of land, it's creating the conditions in which land justice can happen in which conversations can evolve. And I just love this photo. This is the Shinnecock heading out to weed the kelp. All right, number 2, cultural use easements. This is Clayalting. It's an original village site of the Tseninque tribe in California. This land is their sacred village site. It's where they would hold all of their ceremonies. It's now privately owned by a white person who was building relationships with the tribe and eventually asked them, "What do you want? How can we be good partners to you?" And in this case, the tribe said, "You know, we don't actually have the capacity right now to own this land or be the primary managers. At least that's not what we want right now. But we do want to come back to our village site and hold our ceremonies, like the coming of age ceremonies that are so important for our youth." So they wanted to be able to access the land, and they wanted that access to be legally protected. So after that, the landowner worked to remix a conservation easement into something called a cultural use easement. Now, you're likely familiar with conservation easements, whereby an owner gives another entity, often a land trust or a conservancy, the right to make sure that no new development happens on that land. And with those easements, rights are given and protected forever. They go with the land, they go with the title. And the same is true for cultural use easements, except that the rights are slightly different. With a cultural use easement, a tribe or members of a tribe are given the right to access and use the land. So for gathering medicinal plants, practicing ceremony, any cultural or educational practice. And that right is protected also in perpetuity. So here, the trauma of broken promises and broken treaties that many Indigenous people have faced is kind of eased by this agreement that, has legal teeth. This is kind of a blurry picture, but it shows the Tseninque people doing their coming of age ceremony for young women. I believe this is the flower dance at their ancestral village site for the first time in 300 years. So they got to do this ceremony knowing that they'll be able to return and do this dance every year from now on. All right, third one, we're halfway through. This is Stony Point Church in the state of New York. It is a Presbyterian church, or was a Presbyterian church, that back in its heyday had about 200 people in pews on a Sunday. And by about 5 or so years ago, that number had dwindled to about a dozen. And so the presbytery made the hard decision to close the church and absorb the members into a neighboring church. They planned on selling the building, but the church congregants had recently begun building relationships with the Ramapo Lenape, who are the original inhabitants of that land. They had started making connections after being inspired, actually, by the Presbyterian Church's repudiation of the doctrine of discovery in 2019. So it was because of those relationships, they did something else instead of selling it. They gave the church and the land to the Ramapo Lenape, and with them created the Sweetwater Cultural Center. Here we can see a photo of the signing of the transfer of the deed with the leader of the presbytery, along with Chief Dwayne Perry of the Ramapo Lenape. And so with the transfer of that property, the Sweetwater Cultural Center was created, a space of hospitality, cultural practice, and ceremony for Indigenous people in the region, but also around the world, as the UN headquarters is in nearby New York City. We have to remember that Indigenous ceremony is so deeply connected to the earth and to being people of the land, that reclamation of ceremony, which was illegal in the US until 1978, is also a reclamation of their land. So now, as Indigenous leaders and advocates travel thousands of miles from home to represent their nations and defend their lands, and arrive in a remarkably foreign and stressful urban setting, with the Sweetwater Cultural Center, they have a space to go where they can freely practice their religion, rest, and resource themselves spiritually for the global struggle for Indigenous sovereignty. And this is an example of a direct transfer of title. so where ownership transfers, which is the strongest end of the spectrum of land justice because it shifts power, equity, and control. In this case, the deed to the land was gifted to the Ramapo Lenape at no cost, with the deed going to a new nonprofit, which tribal members govern. In contexts where donating land is possible, it can be the most appropriate, as the land was stolen to begin with. And I'll debunk a myth right now and confirm that it is completely legal for a 501c3 to donate land to another entity, including another C3, if that donation is in alignment with the organization's mission and values. So while donating land can be the most just and fitting course of action, I'll add a caveat and say that we've also learned that some BIPOC collectives would prefer a simple purchase rather than a gift that comes with strings, because it can be a cleaner process with clearer autonomy. But even with a purchase, land justice is possible, as you can transfer land through a bargain sale, that is, selling the land at a below market price. A seller can always work with a desired buyer, say a tribe, to determine a price and a timeline that is feasible for them. And they can also offer support in fundraising for purchase, as well as any legal or administrative costs. And that's them in prayer and ceremony after the deed signing. All right, last example, last story. This here is Callie Walker. She's a Methodist minister in Virginia. And the picture on the left is her family's 100-acre farm that she inherited from her father. Callie and her husband dreamed of having an intentional community on the land there, but they were running into some barriers and they were not really finding people that were sticking. One day, Callie went to an organic farming conference, and there she heard a presentation by Duran Chavis, a farmer and food activist in the nearby city of Richmond, where she learned about the history of Black land dispossession in the United States. In the last 100 years, Black farmers went from owning 14% of all farmland to less than 1% because of campaigns of racial terror, as well as racist heirs law practices. So Duran is trying to reclaim the Black community's relationship with land and access to healthy foods in and around Richmond. He's creating this whole BIPOC-led food system that is bringing healthy food and the Black agrarian tradition back into his community that has been denied it for generations. In hearing Duran's story and learning of his work, Callie realized, this is the community dream I was meant to serve. It's actually yours to live out, and I want to support you in doing that. So Callie donated her farm, which is now part of a network of properties in and around the Richmond area, a network that is training a steady stream of Black farmers from small urban plots to larger scale farms like Callie's. And this entire network of properties is communally owned in a really special and different kind of land trust called an agrarian commons, which is designed to protect long-term farmland tenure for farmers. So not only is this land going to good use, but an entirely new model of communally held land stewardship is thriving from it, that carries with it local governance at the grassroots level, as well as national support. And I'll just add that how Callie did this donation is a bit unique. So they donated 90 acres to Duran, which is already becoming an educational farming hub. But the rest of the 10 acres are part of what is called a life estate. And so with this life estate, Callie and her husband are able to continue to live on that part of the property. Once they pass away, those 10 acres will automatically rejoin the other 90 acres and be part of the agrarian commons. So this means that Callie gets to live out her days on the family land right alongside this amazing land justice project. So she says, I'm trading my land for the best neighbors of the world. You know, for her, it was not something of giving away, but really finding something even more meaningful. And, you know, this is an example of using this technique of a life estate, this tool, as well as using a new kind of land trust. And there's a growing number of Indigenous, Black, and POC governed land trusts with the explicit purpose of recovering, protecting, and regenerating lands and reviving communal and ancestral practices. We're going to put a little link in the chat. It's a slightly outdated list from our friends at First Light, but that's a good place to start for finding other Indigenous land trusts. And I'll just also say that Callie's story shows the kind of healing that can happen and the kind of new relational weaving that was not there before when those who hold much of the power and ownership relinquish their control over vision and recognize that we should resource people who hold new or perhaps ancient visions. So in all of these stories, we see again, there is no one way. But all of these stories start with relationship and solidarity, and they end with extending trust and sharing control. In all of them, there's a lot to figure out, and it's not always easy, but there is love and joy present. And I think you can see those in those photos, and there's videos and stuff you can look into too to kind of catch the wave of love in there. And these stories are testament that the decisions that people of faith can make about land can literally create the groundwork for the kind of world and the kind of economy and the kind of lives and paradigms that we dream of and that this earth really needs. And, you know, sometimes we hear like, okay, but is something like a 2-acre plot even meaningful? Like, is that enough to change a paradigm? And I'll just say that that is what a placeless economy wants you to think. But the future is going to be local. It's going to be place rooted. It's going to be about loving the land. And, you know, it's going to happen in places of all shapes and sizes and locations. So again, we're looking at this change of era, which includes our very worldview of what matters or counts as significant. All right, so how can you take part? I'd like to leave you with some ideas for next steps. First and foremost, understand whose ancestral homelands you live on. I imagine many here are familiar with nativeland.ca, but I'll just say, you know, start with an understanding of where you are, the treaties that should be honored, where the original people of the land are now, what happened to them, and what their priorities are today. Are they fighting a lithium mine? Are they cleaning up waters near you? Are they raising money for land recovery or inviting non-native volunteers to join their efforts? Whatever it is, I invite you to show up. And if you or your family or a group you're a part of own land that might be divested in the coming years, I invite you to consider these options and know that there are so many more. It is possible to do this, and it is happening more and more every day. There's a lot of creativity and relationality we can bring to the process that is far more compelling and values aligned than what a conventional real estate agent or lawyer will tell you. So if this is you, make sure you choose your counsel wisely. Of course, it also requires relationship building with potential stewards, but we definitely only recommend beginning that process once you have an understanding of what you can start to offer. BIPOC orgs and tribes are already very under-resourced and don't have time for maybes or make-believe. But if you're at the start of a land transition and want to connect with any of our partners, you can reach out to us at land@nunsandnuns.org. And if you don't own land, there are still a lot of other ways to be in solidarity with the land justice movement. One super easy thing, pay your local land tax or real rent. There are a bunch of city, state, and regionally specific voluntary land taxes that are raising money from non-native residents for the self-determination of grassroots Indigenous groups and tribes. There are more and more cropping up each day. My teammate here just started one in Wisconsin. There's another beginning in Minnesota. So look it up. We're going to drop an incomplete list because, yeah, it keeps growing in the chat. I'll also say, get these conversations going in your church community. Advocate for your church to donate a consistent percentage of their budget as a land tax, or enlist other members to do so. And if your church is thinking about divesting from property or transitioning to some new land use, consider that your church could do something like the stories we just shared. Could donate the land, could do a bargain sale, or could donate a significant percentage of any sale of property to Black and Indigenous groups. Also, just apply this learning to your spheres of influence. Talk to your local government officials, advocate for public lands to go into Indigenous stewardship, state lands, municipal lands, forest land, community parks, even land trusts and conversation groups. They need to be having these conversations as well. And, think about your company, your neighborhood, your book club. Advocate for true histories to be taught in your school district or state, including from Indigenous perspectives. And, in this point about flexing in your sphere of influence, I'll say the climate justice movement and the land justice movement doesn't necessarily need everyone to be working in a movement organization. But what we do need is everyone to be bringing their activism into the work and the roles that they are already in their communities. And lastly, I'll just say, keep learning. We're organizing a lot of educational programming at Nuns and Nuns, and we will be coming up with some very exciting stuff this fall and spring. So sign up for the Land Justice mailing list to stay up to date with new campaigns, partnerships, and learning opportunities. Okay, well, I'm just going to close here. And, I'll just wrap by saying that 2 years into this work, it has become clear just how key land is to both racial and ecological healing, what happens with it, who owns it, who governs it. Land plays an integral role in how communities heal themselves and heal with other communities. It holds our stories. It's the site of our country's great original sins. And as such, repairing those harms through the decisions we make about land today can be our hope. And it's how we will create a livable future for all of us. For those of us who are descendants of settlers, we carry a responsibility and a profound opportunity to step up and into the healing work that is currently left undone. We can be a group of settlers who unsettle and act in solidarity with Indigenous, Black, and other POC-led movements, repairing the harms of colonization and these unjust systems and restoring wholeness. You might be familiar with this image from Meg Wheatley, and it's an image of a dominant system coming to a close and an emergent system arising out of the ashes. So we are in this change of era, as Pope Francis says. We are between worlds. And Wheatley identifies many different roles and jobs related to this work of hospicing the old and midwifing the new. And with land justice, we're really talking about resourcing the new paradigm. So from my perspective, land justice and the work of repair is where the true vitality of the church is lying in wait, where spirit is calling and aliveness is certainly moving. Participating in land justice is not a story of getting smaller, but about fully inhabiting this moment in history, of being awake to it, of resourcing the world we need with the wealth and land that has been amassed by institutions for the last 400 years. Because Johnson versus McIntosh was passed 200 years ago to this year. So imagine what it would look like if we would really act like this was year one of a different paradigm. And what if your parish, your family, your community were a part of that story? When I see communities walk into these kinds of conversations, I see just the absolute best, the most vibrant gifts of faith alive and flourishing. I see the pursuit of truth and justice. I see people reading and responding to the signs of the times and moving resources where the need is greatest. I see courage, I see learning and being willing to open up to ask new questions. And I see community remapping the world. And most of all, I see hope. Thank you so much.
Sarah, thank you so very much. That was just rich and deep and a lot. Thank you. Great. We're going to give you a chance now to talk. We're going to break up into small groups for 10 minutes. And Leela is posting a couple of questions in the chat so you can talk together about tonight's presentation. May I suggest introduce yourself as soon as you get into your group, and then pick out a question for yourself and jump right in. And as soon as I stop talking, Leela's going to send you an invitation to join a breakout room. All you have to do is click the button, say yes, and join into a group, share some wisdom, and we'll reconvene in 10 minutes for some Q&A time with Sarah. So thank you. Leela? Sarah, a few questions have come in. In the meantime, if folks would like to ask a question, please put it in the chat and send it to me. And I will sort through the ones and try to get to as many as we can before we call it a night tonight. Sarah, one person wrote while you were talking, how does a church move into relationship with local indigenous folks? What's the appropriate way to do that? And what resources might they draw from to make that overture?
Great question, and an important question. Yeah, as I imagine many of us have been learning on our own anti-racist journeys, or an unlearning journeys, like it can be complicated to engage, because with it we bring a lot of the patterning of white supremacy that does ongoing harm with folks. And so I think that, you know, Segorte Land Trust has some great resources on what they call coming correct, you know, in terms of learning to be in and things to be investigating in yourself, and also really prioritizing what it is that the indigenous group in your region or in your city is focusing on. So, you know, like the example of the CSJs in Brentwood, they started showing up to their protests. So they weren't asking them to come on, you know, to their turf. They weren't asking them to come and do, you know, ceremony or like teach us something. They were going to show up for what they cared about, what they needed. And so I think it's really important to, center the desires and the needs and the consent of indigenous groups that you're trying to start a reparative relationship with. I'll also say that, you know, sometimes depending on the relationship, you know, having overtures and gestures of apology and repentance. You know, we know, you know, some sisters who, in grappling with their own history of enslavement, have done public events that were also, you know, an attempt to get right and to not try to blow past what actually had happened in the past and like start anew, because you really can't. You have to acknowledge what has happened. You have to take responsibility for your role in the harm, or your group's role in the harm that continues to this day.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Sarah, do you have this question is coming up again and again and again. Resources, a good book to start with that people could take to their congregation that would be a way to sort of introduce the topic.
Yeah, you know, that's a really impossible question. My bookshelves are just full of books. So choosing one, you know, Sarah Augustine's book, The Land Is Not Empty, is great. We have some resources on our website, including a collection of 3 imagination briefs that I think are good resources to start with. Also, like, check out our learning page. There's a whole library really of videos of stewards and folks who are really leading the land back and reparations movements, who've been in some of our webinars. Read their books. It's really not one. This is a lifelong journey. and so it's not going to happen real quick. But we do have a, I think, a really powerful video that we have on YouTube and on our website, that we hosted this conversation, this panel, after the repudiation of the doctrine of discovery. It's only 1 hour long, and we have a discussion guide that comes with it. So if you wanted one thing to discuss with your church or your family or community, you could use that, because I think it's a really powerful beginning. Great.
And can I take this opportunity, Sarah, since you mentioned Sarah Augustine's book, for those of you who are familiar with Just Faith Ministries orbit, if you will, we'll be launching a brand new program on Indigenous justice entitled "The Land Is Not Our Own: Seeking Repair Alongside Indigenous Communities," that uses Sarah Augustine's book as kind of the spine of the program. It's a brand new program. If you're interested in learning more about it, Leela's going to put a link in the chat about it. It will be available in the middle of October, and there'll be several sessions introducing the program. So thank you for the opportunity, Sarah, to do a little advertisement there. I think folks will find it interesting, and it'll be a great follow-up to your presentation tonight. Sarah, someone else asks, do you have any more examples of urban areas that are transitioning? Virginia mentions that her church land is right between City Hall and the university. And so are there other examples you can refer to, or is this just another opportunity for people to find a creative way to sort of move up that mountain that you described in your presentation?
Yeah, there are examples of urban land. I'm thinking of a plot of land that Segorte Land Trust reacquired in Oakland. The Agrarian Commons in Richmond, Virginia is a mix of urban plots and rural plots. Like that's how they're creating that whole food system, is by connecting the smaller farm plots that are kind of more community gardens or like urban centers for teaching people how to farm, to the more kind of large scale farms that people can kind of graduate to. So, there are ways that this definitely needs to happen in both urban and rural settings. I'm trying to think if there's I'll have to think about if there are more urban examples. I think we'll be continuing to make resources that could be helpful for those kinds of specific situations.
Great. Somebody writes, how can I learn more about what Indigenous people are doing in my community? And is there a place to sort of discover that again you could recommend to folks on the call?
Yeah, so that nativeland.ca website is a good place to start, because you can put in your town and see the map that shows you the ancestral territories of Indigenous groups across Turtle Island, and actually, all of the Western Hemisphere. And in that inquiry, it has links to the active tribal government websites, as well as other resources around learning about language, about learning about treaties. And I think there's also just great collectives within the solidarity economy and within the land back movement. So like I would look at some of the the grantees of NDN collectives like work, who they're granting money to. There's a lot of and I'll say also, I think a lot of times we get questions about like how to find people, and I think one of the more helpful pieces of advice that I've heard is that it's actually not about like finding people. Like once we start doing the work of like finding where solidarity is needed, where Indigenous sovereignty struggles are happening, which they're happening everywhere, and start showing up, then we'll learn a lot more about the Indigenous communities in our own backyard. So I think that's one caveat I'd add.
Sarah, and this might be the last question of the night, and it's kind of a practical one. How could you talk a little bit about land acknowledgement and when it could and should be written and used and have some kind of meaning?
Thank you. Yeah, land acknowledgements are can be a helpful awareness and educational tool, but they also can be performative and be problematic when they just kind of don't lead to any other action. And so I think using land acknowledgements as an intervention and as a starting point for a much longer journey is a good approach to make. My friend Sarah Jolena Walcott has a great resource on going beyond land acknowledgements and kind of how it's really part of a much larger journey. We use them in events that we have, but that's because they're part of setting the stage for a lot more that follows, that's really about land justice and repairing relationships. I think that's what I'd say about land acknowledgements. I mean, it's a good move. It's a good move forward, and I'm grateful to the folks who've been really tending that movement in the last decade.
Sarah, one of the ways we can judge the quality of a presentation and the liveliness of the engagement is how many questions we've left unanswered in the chat. And there are dozens, and I'm really regretting that we have to move on, but I just want to say this has been very engaging. I'd like to invite everybody on the Zoom call tonight to show your appreciation with a quiet clap. Sarah, it's been nothing but a pleasure and so compelling, so important, and so helpful, and quite frankly, so hopeful. Despite this is a story that has a lot of wounds and pain connected to it, you discover the hope and present it in a way that is uplifting and still a challenge, still honest, still telling the truth, and yet a way forward, a light forward. And we just all want to thank you for this presentation tonight. So thank you again.
Thank you so much. And please do send me those questions. If there are good, quick answers, I can send them your way and you can share with the folks here.
Yes, and let me just underscore that. If anybody has a question that did not get answered and you'd like us to forward it to Sarah, if you don't have her email address, you can send it to Leela or me, and we'll be glad to get it on to Sarah if that would be helpful. Let me just repeat a couple of announcements very, very quickly. Again, remembering that we'll be launching a brand new program on Indigenous justice entitled The Land Is Not Our Own. That will happen in the middle of October. So if you're interested, you can click the link that Leela shared, or you can go to our website, as information will be there as we approach that October date. And finally, too, remember that we're having our Impact Celebration on Thursday, September 21st. Everybody is welcome. We hope you'll join us. And so until then, let us close in prayer. And I offer this adaptation of what's sometimes referred to as the Serenity Prayer. God, grant us the serenity to accept the things we cannot change, the things in the past. Grant us the courage to change the things that we can, that is, everything around us, and the wisdom to know the difference it will make if we do. Amen. And thank you all for being with us tonight. God bless.